Tennessee was cold this time of year. It was November 1949. The leaves fell off the trees, swaying in the wind, one after another. I lived in Tennessee all my life. It's all I knew. My Meemaw on my mama's side had lived here way before I was born, and so had Mama and Daddy. When I was little, Daddy rocked me in his chair and told me stories about Meemaw. I had just turned 6 years old at the time, but I remembered it like it was yesterday. Mama had been gone from us almost a year. After Mama left, we moved to a small 3-bedroom house in the Canterbury Woods subdivision in Collierville, Tennessee. Daddy said we couldn't stay at our old house in Collierville anymore. That's when I moved to Canterbury Woods. I thought Mama could come with us, but Daddy told me that she was gone. Our house had little red shutters and white paint. The long gravel driveway seemed to go on forever as it winded and turned. Our house backed right up to the woods. On sunny days, I liked going out and catching salamanders and snails with my bare hands. I would reach right down in the river and grab them with Daddy by my side. He held onto my back so I wouldn't fall in. Meemaw was no nonsense. She told it like it is, Daddy said as I peered into his deep eyes. Then he smiled down at me in his lap. My uneven pigtails nestled into Daddy's work shirt while I sat with him in a tan rocking chair in the living room. The chair had stains and scratches from the years of wear and tear. It had been around for generations and had been passed down as a family treasure. My grandma rocked Daddy in it when he was a baby. Creak, creak, that old chair went. One time I came to pick up your mama for a date. I was about 22 at the time, and your mama was 5 years my junior. Your mama grew up with Meemaw in Pocahontas, Arkansas. They moved right outside of Collierville, Tennessee, when your mama was around 6 years old. Meemaw was hoping to find new opportunities in Tennessee. I'm 6 years old now, Daddy, I yelled with glee. I was excited to be the same age as Mama in this story. We had something in common. Daddy chuckled. You sure are right, Pumpkin. Daddy rubbed my head with his hand. Meemaw was a single woman, and it wasn't easy to find solid work. But that didn't stop Meemaw. Daddy stopped rubbing my head and shook his head as he smiled. She was strong and determined. She would go from town to town looking for work, cleaning and tidying up for people's houses. Daddy paused to see if I was still listening. Since I was a daydreamer, I had to keep myself focused. Daddy taught me to look at people's chins when they were talking so I could see the movement up and down. Then I would know when they were done talking. His dad taught him that trick so he wouldn't interrupt him when he was telling a good story. I nodded in agreement, keeping my eyes on Daddy's chin. It slowed down so I knew he was done talking. Daddy nodded at me and smiled, pleased at my attention to his words. Your mama is Meemaw's daughter, Daddy said. That makes Meemaw your grandmother. Daddy's nose crinkled when he talked, and the corners of his mouth turned into a smile. I nodded, a little confused, but I understood the basics. Meemaw was my grandmother on my mama's side. I remember when I arrived at Meemaw's house to pick up Mama for a date. We hadn't gone out but only a few times so far. I wore coveralls with my auto mechanic work shirt and a cowboy hat at the time. I was running late and didn't have time to go home to change after work. Meemaw took one look at me, and when I got to the front door and said, You are not wearing that hillbilly outfit to take out my daughter. Now go put on something respectable. I didn't go to formal school, but I sure did work fixing cars. I guess Meemaw wasn't having that, Daddy laughed. Your mama stood beside me in the front room of her house. Her eyes were wide and nervously darted toward the floor when I tried to make eye contact. She wore a beautiful lavender dress. She even wore a flower in her hair to match her dress. Meemaw turned to your mama standing there in the front room and said, Pauline, you wait here for your date in the parlor. I'm going to take him to find something respectable to wear on a date with my daughter. Then Meemaw smiled at me and nodded for me to follow behind her. Your mama nervously went to wait in the parlor. I didn't know what to do. My knees were shaking so hard. Meemaw, not waiting for me to respond, walked to the back of the house and yelled for me to follow behind her. I ran down the hallway after her so as not to seem impolite. She took me to the storage room at the back of the house where she had a sewing machine neatly on the table and clothes stacked in boxes. Beside the boxes were some paper bags like you get from the grocery store. She handed me a small bag and told me to look inside. I immediately opened the bag and peered inside. I saw what looked like the hem of blue jeans on top, but I couldn't see beneath. My mouth fell open with excitement. I quickly looked up at Mima in disbelief at the nice surprise. She said, "I keep these for some young boys in the neighborhood when they need to go to an interview or do something fancy. I get them from the people whose house I clean." I frowned immediately, Daddy said, looking down at me. I didn't want anything stolen from some rich person's house. Mima frowned back at me, offended. "No, boy, I didn't take them," she said, bringing me back to my senses. Then she snatched the bag back from me. "I'll have you know, I'm no thief, boy. They give them to me." She pointed her little finger and shook it right in my face. I was so embarrassed, Meredith. Daddy said to me with his eyes full of emotion. How could I insult the woman of the house? I just wasn't thinking. I quickly apologized. "I'm so sorry, ma'am," I told her. "I must have just forgotten my manners." I quickly bowed and pleaded for mercy. Mima nodded slowly. Then she sighed. After a moment, she smiled back at me and handed the bag over. She told me a second time to look inside. "This time, don't judge," she said, huffing under her breath. "Yes, ma'am." I frowned immediately, Daddy said, looking down at me. I didn't want anything stolen from some rich person's house. Mima frowned back at me, offended. "No, boy, I didn't take them," she said, bringing me back to my senses. Then she snatched the bag back from me. "I'll have you know, I'm no thief, boy. They give them to me." She pointed her little finger and shook it right in my face. I was so embarrassed, Meredith. Daddy said to me with eyes full of emotion, "How could I insult the woman of the house?" I just wasn't thinking. I quickly apologized. "I'm so sorry, ma'am," I told her. "I must have just forgotten my manners." I quickly bowed and pleaded for mercy. Mima nodded slowly. Then she sighed. After a moment, she smiled back at me and handed the bag over. She told me a second time to look inside. "This time, don't judge," she said, huffing under her breath. "Yes, ma'am," I replied politely. "Phew," Daddy said, wiping his brow with his right hand. He seemed relieved that moment of his life was over. I smiled at Daddy. I was glad, too, that Mima had let Daddy keep seeing Mama. "So what happened then, Daddy? What did you do with the clothes?" I rested my hands again on my chin and looked at Daddy. This time I looked into his eyes. They were full of wonder and joy. Daddy smiled down at me in his lap. I think he enjoyed the happiness I got from listening to his stories. Well, I reached into the bag that Mima gave me and pulled out a pair of crisp jeans, a white shirt, and suspenders. "Woohoo!" Daddy whistled. It was like Christmas morning. The clothes were freshly pressed and everything. I didn't know if Mima had pressed them or if it was the people she cleaned for who had done it. Then Daddy shook his head and looked up at the ceiling. Even though a part of me wanted to say no to the gift out of pride, I couldn't say no to Mima. She wasn't taking no for an answer anyway. Daddy laughed as he leaned back in the rocking chair and looked over at the large clock on the wall. Mima sounds so neat and generous, I thought. I want to be just like her when I grow up. Daddy said, "I went in the bathroom and looked in the mirror after I put those clothes on. I'm not going to lie, baby girl. I looked sharp. I was smiling at myself and beaming in that bathroom mirror. I hoped your mama would like it, those clothes being handed down from her mama and all. I still had to wear my steel-toe work shoes with it, but I didn't care." Daddy leaned back in the rocking chair while he held me in his lap. He rocked steadily back and forth. Your mama took one look at me and said, "Why, you look handsome, Mr. Beau Graham." I squinted my eyes as I looked at Daddy. Beau? I hadn't heard that name before. Daddy stopped leaning back in his chair so he could look down at me. "Beau is my middle name," Daddy smiled. "Folks in the neighborhood where I grew up in Collierville and at the school used to call me by my middle name. They said Carlton was too fancy for me. They said I looked more like a beau." Daddy laughed. "People sure do take their liberties. But I didn't mind when your mama did it. I liked her calling me Beau. It was like she knew me." I cut in and said, "So how did you and Mommy meet, Daddy?" I was eager to hear more about Mama and Daddy, especially Mama. She was like a riddle waiting to be solved. "Sure thing, Pumpkin," Daddy nodded. "Well, Mama grew up near Collierville. You know that part of the story. But what you may not know is that Back then, we learned in one-room schoolhouses. Although I lived right inside Collierville and your mama lived outside the city, people from miles around joined together to learn. The teachers were very smart. Your mama was 5 years younger than me, but she was in my class. Many of us from different grades were learning together in the same room. I always had an eye on your mama. She was favored by the teacher and always got the most attention. Daddy beamed from ear to ear. She was so attentive and eager to learn. Despite her circumstances at home being hard with just her and her mama, she didn't let that stop her. She came to class every day prepared to learn and take notes. Mama sounds so strong, I thought. She is just like me, Ma. I desired even more now to be like them than I did when Daddy first started telling me this story. But one thing bothered me. Why didn't Mama have a daddy? Thank you for listening to the first chapter of Generations. This is a charming story of a girl named Meredith who finds herself raised by her father after her mother leaves unexpectedly. Her father has struggles of his own, but he does his best to raise her as they battle and go through their journey of inner healing for their family, dealing with emotional and social issues that impact so many in our society today. Follow along with these characters as they learn to grow through their spiritual inner healing journey. Be blessed. And don't forget to purchase your copy on Amazon or wherever books are sold online.